The last chapter was interested in getting your robots to move, sort of at any means necessary. In this chapter, we'll explore getting your robots to move in a precise manner. We'll first look at modeling DC motors, and then how do we actually control the direction that a motor is spinning. When we look at the motor model, we'll see that you have to be able to vary the direction of current, which is sort of similar to attaching a battery in one direction and then reversing the direction that the battery is connected. And that's essentially what an H-bridge allows us to do electronically. We'll then look at how our microcontroller can send PWM signals, or pulse width modulated signals, over to the motor driver so that we can vary the speed. So we'll look at the direction, how we can vary that, then we'll look at how to vary the speed. That's essentially what we've done in previous chapters. What really sets this one apart is that we will measure that speed using the quadrature encoders attached to the back of your DC motors. Using those encoders, we'll measure the motor's motion, and then we can use that through a process known as proportional control to more precisely control the speed of each motor. Here's a diagram, or a simplified diagram of a DC motor. It lists out really just the most important parts of getting a motor to operate. The most conspicuous parts are probably these large blocks on the outsides, and those are permanent magnets. They're called permanent magnets because they don't need any electrical signal, they don't need any external force, they don't need anything acting on them to produce a magnetic field. If these were drawn a little more precisely, if you're used to seeing a magnet with both poles showing, it would be split sort of down this side, and you would see south here and north here, and then the opposite on this side. The most important part is that you have a magnetic field flowing across in one direction. The permanent magnets are attached to the inner side of the stator. The stator is essentially the outer housing of your DC motor. So if you think of that tin, sort of silvery colored outer housing, there are permanent magnets attached to the inside of that. Next most conspicuous is probably this bit here. That includes your power source. So you've got your positive power source and your negative. And you could swap that in either direction. There's no real polarity to motors. The polarity really just tells you which direction the motor is going to rotate. Both are valid. These little blue pieces are brushes. So this is a brushed DC motor, which is really the cheapest and most commonly found type of DC motor. And it's the kind that I have listed for the kits in this course. The yellow piece that's split in half, you can think of it as like a cylinder that's split down the middle so the two halves of the cylinder aren't connected, is called the commutator. The pink wire is the coil, sometimes called the armature. And finally, the last part to point out is this dashed line here, which is indicating where the axle would reside. So in this case, the axle would be rotating either in this direction or in that direction, depending on the direction of the current passing through the coil. In the case of this diagram, with power being positive on the left and negative on the right, we would expect conventional current to flow in this direction. So from the power source, through the brush, through the commutator, around the coil, back out the other side. When you have current traveling through a coil of wire like this, or really any wire, but normally you would have several wraps of coil going through this same route. When you have many wires all sort of traveling in the same direction with current flowing in the same direction, you can take your right hand and point your thumb in the direction of the current and curl your fingers, and that'll tell you the direction in which a magnetic field is flowing around the coil of wire or the strands of wire. So in this case, you would have the current flowing sort of outside to in over the top this direction, and then in the opposite direction on the other side, since current is traveling in the opposite direction on the other side. So taking into account those two magnetic fields, you have B, which is the magnetic field flowing from one permanent magnet to the other side, and then your magnetic fields traveling around the coil. You can use those diagrams to figure out what the force is from the magnetic field acting on the wires themselves. The equation for this force is dependent upon the current, which has a direction of travel, the amount of current, and the magnetic field. In this case, we use the left-hand rule to decide the direction of the force and how it's acting on the wire. So you point your finger in the direction of B. So in this case, your left-hand index finger should be pointing from left to right. Then you point your middle finger in the direction of current. So if we're looking at this side, your middle finger would be pointing back towards your chest. Oh, I'm sorry, away from your chest. And then your thumb is pointing in the direction that the force acts on the wire, which in this case would be down, and on the other side would be up. So with power flowing in this direction, we would get a counterclockwise rotation on the wire itself. And the important part here, the sort of clever part of how a motor is controlled, is in the commutator. What we really want to make the motor continuously rotate is for whichever side of the wire is on the left side, whether it be the current side here, this piece of wire, or the other piece, when it actually ends up rotating to the other side, we always want whichever wire is on the left side for the force to be down, and likewise the force to be up, regardless of which side the wire is actually on. And that's handled by the commutator. So as electricity is flowing through and rotating the coil, at some point side 1 is going to rotate around, and this part of the commutator is going to, the brush here is going to enter the gap on that side of the commutator. And as this gap approaches this brush, the gap on the other side will approach this brush. There will be a brief moment where the commutator is not contacting either side's wires, but the momentum will carry it. So in this case, if it's still rotating counterclockwise, side 1 will then connect to the opposite brush. So side 1 will connect to the right brush, and side 2 will connect to the left brush. Thus, when side 1 is having current flow in this direction, and when it rotates around to the other side, it'll then have current flowing in the opposite direction. It'll go from being connected to the positive side to being connected to the negative side. A simplified model for our DC motor is given on this slide here. A common way to represent this DC motor is with simple electronic components. So we can have our power supply connected to one side, and this would be the input voltage across those two terminals. So we could connect a battery directly to that, or we could connect our motor driver and let it vary the power connected to the motor. everything inside the dashed box will belong to sort of the motor and its components. Since the motor has a copper coil of wire, we need to model the resistance due to that copper wire. One type of component I didn't mention when we were talking about Ohm's law and electrical components in the first couple of lectures is an inductor. A good analogy for an inductor is it's sort of a heavy ball that you're trying to roll on a flat plane. So it's hard to get it started, but then once it gets up to speed, it's hard to slow it down. You can think of current flowing through an inductor as, well, initially the inductor will resist any current flowing, but then once current starts flowing, it'll resist you changing the current at that point. This is due to the magnetic field that's generated by the coil of wire. After the inductor, we need to model the fact that our motor is going to have not just an electrical part to it, but a physical part. It's going to rotate a shaft. And I'll just draw the rotation here sort of arbitrarily in the clockwise direction. We also need to model the fact that across these 2 points here, so the positive and negative terminals of that are connected to the armature, the coil, we have something called the back EMF, the voltage EMF. And that stands for, EMF does, the electromotive force. And I should stress that this really is a simplified model of a DC motor. It doesn't capture everything, but it captures enough for us to understand how we should best control it. From this model, the most important takeaway that you can have is the relationship among the two things that we care most about. That would be V, which down here I called Vn, and alpha, which over here I haven't yet labeled. Alpha is going to be the rate, the angular velocity, the angular rate that the shaft is spinning. Probably not surprisingly, you can see a proportional relationship between the two. But it is complicated by these other two factors, which means it's not sort of perfectly proportional. Increasing the voltage should increase the angular rate, but depending on how many coils of your wire, you'll increase the inductance, you'll also increase the resistance. So an increase here will have a proportional increase on the right-hand side, but not all of that increase is seen as a change in the angular rate. Instead, an increase here will increase the inductance, which doesn't directly increase the angular rate. So it's not a one-to-one mapping, essentially. The one term I haven't yet described is kV. And that stands for the speed constant of a motor. It's a physical property of the motor, and it's something that you would have to measure if you really wanted to completely be able to model your motor, for example, in simulation. Most of the time, and definitely for this class, we're going to assume that we are only really caring about controlling the speed of the motor, and we'll mostly ignore that the rest of these constants exist. It is worth noting, though, this equation at least once, so that you know there are sort of more complex physical and electrical characteristics behind the scenes. A full listing of all of these terms is given on the next slide, and the slides will be on the course website for this chapter. I won't go into details on these values, but I do have a nice pointer here for how they're derived, and there will be more information on the course website. The takeaway from this first part of the lecture that I want you to remember is really this relationship. What happens to the output, in this case speed, and we'll give that in usually radians per second, because it's the speed of the shaft, not necessarily the speed of your robot. What's the relationship with voltage? And that's given in volts. Because your motor has physical properties, it's not just an electrical component, there's going to be friction involved. So friction that resists a change in the current angular position of the shaft. And so it takes a certain amount of power or input voltage or current, depending on how you're trying to view your system, before anything actually happens. So for low voltages, you'll notice that your robot's not moving at all. That doesn't necessarily mean that your motor's broken. It just means that it's not able to overcome friction. It's trying to move, it's just not overcoming that initial friction. After that, your motor more or less acts linearly. As you increase the voltage, speed will increase linearly. At a certain point, though, that'll taper off, and then much beyond that, you'll start melting your wires, and that looks something like this, with a big explosion. Okay, maybe not a big explosion, but your motor won't work anymore if you melt the wires. For the purposes of this class, we're really going to try to operate really just inside a very narrow region, the one that's most predictable. We really like this linear region. We don't want to have our voltage too high, and we definitely don't want our voltage too low when the robot's sort of unable to move because there's a tiny little speck of dirt on the ground in front of the wheel, causing it even higher amounts of friction than normal. So we'll have a sort of min cutoff and a max cutoff. There should not be a negative sign there. That'll come up later. You'll want to define those for your robot. Yours will be a little bit different than mine depending on the mass of your chassis. So maybe yours is 3D printed and it's heavier. And the quality of your wheels. So if they drag more, or if they're heavier or larger, your minimum cutoff might have to increase. On the other hand, if you make yours as light as possible and it's smaller, everything is sort of compact, then maybe your minimum cutoff's lower. And since these terms are important, that'll be the subject of an exercise in a few weeks.